Before we get started, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that wherever you are, as we've been talking about, you are calling in from Indigenous land. And thank you to all of you for thinking about whose land you're on and the various different peoples. And we'll drop a link, nativeland.ca. So if you don't know whose land you're on, you can take a look at that map. But at MOHAI, we are on the historic and contemporary lands of the Duwamish, Suquamish, Muckleshoot, and all Coast Salish people. People who were forcibly removed, but whose endurance we honor with deep respect and gratitude for their stewardship of this place, and whose histories and presence we want to be learning more about. And that's why we're so excited to be thinking and learning about food sovereignty tonight with Dr. Charlotte Coté. So I'm going to turn it over to Kiku now to tell you more. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Kiku Hughes. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a white passing mixed race woman with short, straight brown hair. I'm sitting in front of a blank wall and wearing a gray crew neck sweater. And I'm very excited to share, to present today, to moderate our discussion with Dr. Charlotte Coté. Charlotte Coté is of the Tseshaht and Nuu-chah-nulth, and is Associate Professor of American Indian Studies at the University of Washington. Her current book, A Drum in One Hand, a Sockeye in the Other, Stories of Indigenous Food Sovereignty from the Northwest Coast, explores Indigenous food sovereignty and how food plays a major role in physical, emotional, spiritual, and dietary wellness. So Charlotte, if you'd like to come on screen and introduce yourself.
Ayahuasca, so everyone, greetings. Good evening. Ukhlama flotis mayot. Tseshaht aksuma. Nuu-chah-nulth. I'm sharing my language with you, and I'm telling you that my indigenous name is flotis mayot. It means carrying thunder. It comes from my whaling lineage. I am Tseshaht from the Tseshaht Nation, and we are one of the member groups of the larger Nuu-chah-nulth Nation on the west coast of Vancouver Island. But I'm not in this Zoom box in my home territory. I am in Seattle. I teach at the University of Washington, as Kiko said. And I want to acknowledge that I'm not in my ancestral territory. Where the University of Washington is located, it's Duwamish land. There were Duwamish villages in that area. And I also want to recognize the lands and the shared waters of the Duwamish, the Suquamish, the Muckleshoot, the Puyallup, the Tulalip, the people in this area who share, where there was these connections through the shared waters, especially because we're marine-based cultures and societies. And so I want to respect and acknowledge that before I begin. I also want to thank all of you for being here today and sharing your Zoom box. And I look forward to hearing your questions and engaging further with all of you later. I want to also say tleko, or thank you, to MOHAI and to the University of Washington Press for coordinating this event this evening. And I also want to extend a tleko, or a thank you, to the ASL interpreters who are here today. So before I begin talking about food sovereignty, I want to just share a little bit about who I am and place what I'm going to be speaking and into this into that perspective of coming from me as an Indigenous person from this area. So I am from the Nuu-chah-nulth, larger Nuu-chah-nulth Nation. We're on the west coast of Vancouver Island. Our hahulthi, or our ancestral homelands, are all along the coast. And in 1978, we took the larger name for our tribal council that brings our 14 groups together the name Nuu-chah-nulth, which literally means all along the mountains, all along the sea. I also included on this slide what I shared earlier, just to help for people who are working with the ASL interpreter, so that you will have that, that opening introduction that I shared. So Tseshaht is one of the 14 linguistically and culturally related nations that comprise the Nuu-chah-nulth nation. Our name literally translates to the people of Tseshaht. And there's an area, and I don't know, can you all see my arrow?
I think so, yeah.
Is it showing up? Okay, there's
yes,
an
yes.
area here in the Broken Group Islands on the west coast of Vancouver Island. Beautiful area. It's part of our traditional territory. And as you can see, we're right along the ocean where these islands come together, known as the Broken Group. There's a place on one of those islands, the area known as Tseshaht, where we were created. We can walk to a spot on that island, and that's where the Tseshaht were created. We don't reside there anymore. We do have access through the reservation or the reserve system that was created in Canada, very similar to the reservation system, where some of those islands are, we still can access because they are recognized as reserve lands, Tseshaht reserve lands. But our principal village is, and I'm going to use my arrow again, up here along, this is a Broken Group, and if you go up through the Alberni Inlet, you come up here to the Sumaas, or the Tsomas River. It was renamed by settlers. We have a winter village there, and that became our permanent village after colonization in the mid 1800s. So that's a little bit about me.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing all that important contextual information. I thought we should really start with a groundwork to let people know what food sovereignty means as a general movement, and also what it means to indigenize food sovereignty.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you for that question. The food sovereignty movement really grew in the 1990s, and I'm going to, I've got some notes here, and I'm going to look at my notes, or I will go off on tangents. It grew in the 1990s in response to global hunger and food insecurity. The UN's Food and Agricultural Organization, or the FAO, defines food security as a situation that exists when all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and preferences for an active and a healthy life. But in 2019, when I started looking more specifically at some of these numbers, more than 7.7 billion people in the world are food insecure. They are food insecure. This food insecurity largely stems from the global shifts in food production in the mid-18th century, which resulted in a move away from small-scale polyculture farming to a more industrialized and capitalist mode of food production that focused on monoculture agriculture. So a 2019 study estimates, as a result of this shift in our diets, that 1 in 5 deaths globally are associated with a Western diet that is high in salt, sugar, and fat. Think about that, 1 in 5 globally. And so I have here on my slides, you know, you walk into a store, and I tell my students this, You walk into a store, on the left, you usually have all the baked goods, all the vegetables. On the right, you maybe have the meats and, you know, and the seafoods. I say, you go to those sides, that's real food. You go to everything in the middle, it's not real food. It's packaged. A lot of the foods are made with high fructose corn syrup. The shift of many of the monoculture crops that we have today have shifted to these kinds of crops where you can use one crop and use that and change it and process that crop into many different kinds of packaged and industrialized foods. So that's what I'm showing here. And also we have a health industry that supports this. And I've got this statement here: people are fed by the food industry, which pays no attention to health. We see that in the large supermarkets today. And we're treated by a health industry that pays no attention to food. So think about that. Maybe we can come back and talk about that if that's something that you're interested in. But I want to keep going and looking at food sovereignty, where this came from. The food sovereignty movement was initiated in 1996 by a transnational organization of peasants called La Via Campesina. I think I have, let's see, here we go. La Via Campesina represented 148 organizations from 69 countries. They called for the right of all peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food, and the right to define their own food and agricultural systems. They framed their position with this larger rights-based discourse, that it was a right to these foods, rights to healthy foods, rights to nutritious foods. And they were a movement that really challenged this hegemony of the globalized, neoliberal, industrial, capital-intensive, corporate-led model of agriculture. And really this food regime that they were challenging had created very destructive economic policies that marginalized small-scale farmers, removed them from their land, forced them into a global market as wage laborers. And so we really start seeing challenges to that by La Via Campesina, where they come up with this concept, food sovereignty, that food sovereignty is a right of peoples to healthy and culturally food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and the right to define their own food and agricultural systems. It puts the aspirations and needs of those who produce, distribute, and consume food at the heart of the food systems and policies rather than the demands of the market and the corporations. So what do I mean then? And looking at what food sovereignty is, this movement that we started seeing developing in the 1990s, bringing back those, you know, that bringing back into those larger conversations around global food regimes, the small scale farmers' voices, bringing back into those conversations the women's voice. The women's voice was completely, in many ways, removed or ignored or silenced as a result of these shifts in a global food regime that moved to more corporate-led and capitalist intensive markets. So in thinking about this notion of indigenizing food sovereignty then, it really moves it beyond it being just this rights-based discourse. That is, that it's your right to something. Because if it's a right, a political or economic right, that means you're waiting for that right to be acknowledged. And you're usually waiting for that right to be acknowledged from political systems that really in many ways continue to ignore the Indigenous voice. So what I'm saying is, let's move away from that and emphasize the responsibilities and the relationships that we have to our environment and that we have to those foods that we recognize as our ha'um, as our cultural foods, that we recognize a relationship with our non-human kinfolk. So Indigenous food sovereignty then is defined within a restorative context that is for us as Indigenous peoples to move towards food sovereignty. It means really taking the responsibility to re-engage with our homelands again, to re-engage with those foods and to bring those foods back into our diet. But there's so many issues that we have in trying to do that. And so I want to just go back to this screen that I brought up earlier, and place it into a context. So in looking at Indigenous food sovereignty then, and it being defined within this restorative context, why do we need to restore those connections? Why do we need to restore those relationships? Well, approximately 400 million Indigenous peoples worldwide face the most serious food insecurity because of the incessant impact of settler colonialism. The tragic history of colonialism and resulting economic, social, and cultural marginalization has had a profound impact, health impacts on Indigenous peoples worldwide. And it's through our loss of our homelands, through urbanization, many of our people moving into the urban centers, a decline in traditional harvesting practices, environmental contamination. We're seeing that here on the West Coast, especially with fish farms up and down the Northwest coast, and also changes in our lifestyle, more sedentary lifestyles that have also seen shifts in those foods that we're consuming on a daily basis. I want to also have you think about this within the context of what we've been facing for the last couple of years, and that's with COVID-19. This worldwide pandemic really brought economic and social devastation to many people. But what it did was reveal the stark contrasts between the fortunate and the vulnerable in our societies. The virus did not, it impacted people from all groups indiscriminately. We know that. But it was the ability to respond that was unequal. And because of racial and economic inequities embedded here in the US political system and economic system, as well as in Canada's and the country I grew up in, these effects of the coronavirus were compounded for Indigenous peoples, as well as people that were vulnerable, as well as communities of color. Many of our people even lack the means to resist the contagion, and many, many Indigenous nations, including mine, were hit hard by the coronavirus. The media, health officials, and politicians would continue to focus on this vaccine. You know, as we were going through this, trying to think through how we were going to get through it, every time you turned on the TV, it talked about a vaccine. And I'm not saying it shouldn't have. Yes, we should have, and we needed it. And we have it now, and we needed that vaccine. But I also wanted to see attention placed on food in our industrialized food system, and to start a conversation around that. Because why was there little attention to the foods we eat, to the foods that we see in the grocery stores, where 80% of those foods are not nutritious and unhealthy, especially the cheaper foods that many people who do face socioeconomic marginalization can have access to, those organic foods or the foods that will provide them nutrients to withstand the disease, to withstand the coronavirus. So I really want to say we really need to take time to seriously question the global industrial food system. And I really hope getting through this pandemic, and I hope that we're on the other side of it, that we can start having conversations around that. So I wanted to bring that in, but I also want to move back, and then I'll finish here on what I wanted to say about settler colonialism. You can't talk about settler colonialism without talking about the boarding schools. And if you don't know about the boarding schools, please go and Google boarding schools in both Canada and the United States. It's a tragic history. It really is. And it's one that we still feel today because of how trauma is passed down through the generations. Even though those boarding schools, many of them closed years ago, we still suffer from collective historical trauma. And if any of you are zooming in from Canada, you know what has happened with all the unveiling of these unmarked graves in these former boarding school sites now that are really bringing back that trauma. Well, that trauma is still being experienced because of the perpetuation of settler colonialism, which I have included here on this slide, so you can understand what those mean, what those both mean. But I also want to put it into the perspective of health and wellness. When those children were removed from our communities, when they were taken away, they didn't have access to their homelands. They did not have access to their communities. They did not have access to their families, and they did not have access to their traditional ha'um, their cultural foods. They were removed from those nutritious foods. So there, you know, along with the loss of our homelands, urbanization, decline in traditional harvesting, as I mentioned, we also start seeing a growth in these lifestyle diseases that are becoming an epidemic within many of our Indigenous communities. Type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, hypertension, autoimmune disease, obesity. We see these increasing, and we see it increasing in US society, Canadian society, as well as other industrial societies, but we see it even increasing more in Indigenous societies because we continually face what has happened to our communities with the loss of these homelands, with the perpetuation of settler colonialism. So it impacts us even on that much more of a level. That was a long answer to your question, Kiko.
No, it was great. And it was a broad question. So I thank you for providing all that context. I did want to mention that, a lot of the ways that you explain these really complicated, vast concepts in your book is by telling stories and telling these personal stories that sort of relate to these larger topics. I was wondering if you would be able to share a story with us to sort of get started in digging deeper into the book itself.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for asking. So, and I just wanted to point out these photos that I have on the slides. The photo on the left is one of our wonderful community members, Nitanis Desjardins, who, and I can't remember now if I have a slide about my food symposium, I'll talk about it later, but she's a wonderful harvester, videographer that has done beautiful films. Look her up, Nitanis Desjardins, and she's with my sister Gail. Both of them are people who I feature in my book. And that's Nitanis hand picking the salmon berries. We were out harvesting that day, so I took some photos of them. So this story I'm going to read to you is a story about picking kalkawi. And I was raised in the berry picking tradition, as I say here. That's a photo of my late grandparents, Huey Watts and Grace Watts, and I love that photo, absolutely love it. And this is them, not them, the hand that you see is one of my other relatives who this story is about, picking the wild trailing blackberry. And so this story is going to talk about the berry picking, and we are going to focus on my auntie Mispun. And this is the story that I start my book with. And the story is called Shut Up, We're Bonding. So I'm going to read it from my book. On a hot summer day, my auntie Mispun and I were doing what we had always done since I was a young girl. We were driving on winding, dusty gravel roads up steep mountains in the Hahulfi, ancestral homelands of my people, the Tseshaht on the west coast of Vancouver Island, on our quest for the sweet and delectable kulkawi, the wild trailing blackberry. These kulkawi are quite different than the tupkapea, which is the Himalayan blackberry that that were brought here from Europe and grow alongside the roads close to the urban centers. The kulkawi is much smaller, hardier, and considerably richer in antioxidants than its tame cousins, and is high in vitamin C, potassium, magnesium, and other flavonoid phytochemicals. It grows high in the mountains, in flat areas within the dense coastal rainforests that blanket the northwest coast. It almost seems like a misnomer to call kulkawi wild. The Nuu-chah-nulth, that is the Nuu-chah-nulth people, like other Indigenous peoples, cultivated lands in our haholli to encourage growth of certain food plants. And this was done through sophisticated, selective, and controlled burning, promoting the growth and production of berry vines. But through colonization and forced placement on reserve lands, we lost many of our traditional harvesting sites, which fell under the control of the forestry companies. And as a result, we lost our ability to engineer the lands for production. However, this ancestral knowledge continued to be transferred through the generations. And my grandfather, Huey Watts, Auntie Mispin's father, was raised with the understanding and ecological knowledge of land burning. Grandpa would drive through our former harvesting sites and take note of where the forestry companies were slash burning to remove the underbrush, to make it easier to cut trees and remove the fallen logs. He knew that in a few years, these would be ideal growing areas for the kulkawi. Grandpa passed on his cultural knowledge to us, especially the knowledge of where to find the best nutchu, or the best berry patch. But this afternoon was not the day for finding a good nutchu, and there we were, hours later, still looking for one. The day shifted into the late afternoon, and I was getting tired of looking for kulkawi, what seemed to be a hopeless situation. I was about ready to tell my auntie we should just give up and go home. And then my auntie steered around a slight bend in the gravel road, and there it was, a few yards ahead of us on the right side of the road, a nutchu, a berry patch. My aunt slammed on the vehicle brakes and hastily pulled over to the side of the narrow road. Since the sun was already going down on this side of the mountain, we needed to hurry. We grabbed our berry picking pails out of the trunk of the car and ran to the small patch of ripe, deep purple kulkawi just waiting to be plucked from their hardy vines. I found a comfortable spot close to the road, and Auntie Mispin made her way through the vines to start picking from the other side of the patch, about 20 feet away. And then we began plucking berries to our heart's content. My head was down, my fingers were going a mile a minute, and my thoughts were lost in berry picking heaven. We'd been picking for about 15 minutes when I suddenly felt my aunt rush past me. I pulled my head up from the vines to ask what the heck was going on. "What's the matter?" I queried. Sometimes when we were picking berries, we'd run into bears that were also enjoying a berry feast. And while they usually did not bother us, we had to be cautious if we encountered a mother with her cubs, as she likely did not want us to come near her. But I looked around and did not see any bears. "Bees, bees," Auntie Mispin yelled, madly swatting at the air around her head as she ran toward our vehicle. My aunt had stepped right into the middle of a nest. "What the hell?" I gasped. I grabbed my pail and stumbled to my feet, spilling all the juicy berries I was dreaming about eating when I got home. I sprinted behind my aunt while swatting at the bees that were now after me. We got into the vehicle and jumped inside. Auntie Mispin started the car and we drove off, leaving behind the bees and leaving behind most of our kulkawi, our berries. By this time, I'd had enough and I was ready to call it a day. I was tired, I was hungry, and I was aching from the couple of bee stings I received. But not my Auntie Mispin. She wanted her kulkawi and the boiling sun, dust, dirt, hunger, and a few bee stings were not going to keep her from getting them. I looked at my aunt and I said, it's hopeless. Why don't we just go home? This is crazy. We're never going to find any more berries. My aunt responded, shut up, we're bonding. And with a trickle of sweat running down her cheek, a slight smile on her lips, and a persistent look in her eyes, she continued driving up the mountain. I really share that story, Kiku, and all of you listening, because the colonial racer, the way that colonization attempted to erase us, and I'm going to change my glasses over here, really goes beyond just removing us or forcing us off our lands or away from our waters or away from our foods. It's just as much about silencing our voices, erasing our ability to pass on our cultural knowledge, and then in many ways having this ethnocentric belief that you could talk, settlers or settler society could talk for us. So it's really not surprising then that I would try to include or frame the narrative within the storytelling tradition as a way to speak back against colonization, as a way to center my book in Indigenous knowledge and the way we transferred knowledge through the oral tradition, and through the methodology of storytelling. Indigenous peoples come from oral traditions with our knowledge, our theories, our epistemological frameworks that were developed and maintained and transferred from generation to generation. So these stories are really grounded in that, grounded in our personal experiences, while also simultaneously being grounded in the larger context of family, of community, of culture in a very, very profound way. So I really wanted to have every chapter in this book start with a story as a way of creating that space or creating an Indigenous narrative that I could frame the rest of my, the rest of the information that I share in my book, to frame it within that storytelling tradition.
Yeah, I love that. And that story is so great. Thank you so much for sharing it. And it looks like, I mean, I don't know when that photo was taken, but it looks like you did eventually find all those berries again. So,
yeah, and that came from the ending, as I mentioned it, because what I wanted, the reason why I wanted to open with that story, and I'm going to go to the end of the chapter, because I open with that story and I end with the kind of the second part of the story. I always, when I started writing my book, I really, really wanted to have berry picking photos, but we never, you never thought about that when we were kids, or my relatives thought about taking photos. And I really wanted that because as I was doing my research on food traditions, I reflected back on what my auntie said to me when we had been out berry picking, and why she said we were bonding. And she intuitively understood how our berry picking tradition maintained and reinforced our connections to those berries that were giving their life to us, to our homelands that we were in as we were out harvesting those berries, and also reinforced the bonds to each other, reinforce that love between an aunt and her niece. And so when I started the research, my auntie was really excited about my book, and what I was going to share. And I said, you need to go out. I can't go home because I usually teach in the summer. And so she went out with one of my cousins, my cousin Melanie. And Melanie said she was so excited. She says, we need to get photos for Charlotte's book. We're going to be famous. We're going to be in her book. And this is one of the photos. This is of my auntie on that berry picking adventure. And she was with Melanie, and Melanie said she was just laughing watching her. And I wanted to include it because I never got to pick Kofkawi with my auntie again. My auntie succumbed to cancer a year after that and passed away. So I pay tribute to her by keeping that story and starting my book with that story, because she was the person who I used to pick berries with all the time. She was, you know, my youngest aunt of my mom's family, of all her siblings, of 11 of them. And so it really, I wanted to make sure and share that story.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much. That's beautiful. And one of the things that you discuss in the book, and the things sort of related to the importance of storytelling as a method of knowledge transference, I guess. I think of storytelling, one of the, you know, ways that it helps the community pass on knowledge is that it's not a one-sided thing. There's a concept of, you know, telling a story, but the listener is also interpreting the story and changing it as they listen, and they tell the story themselves. And it sort of takes me to the next question about reciprocity and these concepts of interconnectedness and reciprocity that comes up in a lot of different Indigenous philosophies throughout the world. And you discuss that in the book. Can you talk a little bit about the sort of relationship between that concept of reciprocity and how that relates to food systems, and to how colonial food systems in place now are going against that sort of concept of reciprocity?
Yes, great. Thank you. That's a great question. Yeah, I really want us to all think about, you know, what, and thinking about this within what I already had shared about Indigenous food sovereignty. That concept, food sovereignty, really entails rebuilding, as I said, because of what colonization and perpetuation of settler colonialism has done to us in weakening those relationships that we have with our environment. So it means rebuilding those relationships, rebuilding our relationships with the natural world, and also with our non-human kinfolk. The human ecosystem, this relationship is characterized as one of reciprocity and respect. It's what we base our worlds on. It's what we really need to strengthen as we start really bringing back our foods, or trying to incorporate our cultural foods back into our diet. And it looks at this notion of reciprocity, where humans don't control nature, but live in harmony with it. And that's a really interesting concept to think about, you know, especially when you think about seeing humans as, you know, within, you know, everything on the world, that humans somehow sit on the top of that, or, you know, we see this kind of pyramid with humans, and then, you know, the other things in the world underneath. In Indigenous worldview, we see ourselves in a reciprocal relationship with everything around us. Dr. Robin Kimmerer wrote this wonderful book called Braiding Sweetgrass. And if you haven't read it, I don't know if anyone can put a link in the chat. It's an absolutely beautiful book. She's a scientist. She is also a botanist. And she does a lot of research around traditional ecological knowledge and the connection, the intersections of that with Western science. And her book is very poetic in how she writes. And I, you know, she looks at this in her book, this notion of reciprocity, and she says, restoring the health of Indigenous communities requires restoring the health of the land. And she aptly says, we restore the land will restore us. And I really, really like that, and think about that. We restore the land in turn restores us. So Indigenous food sovereignty is defined within this restorative context, one that works to nurture individual and community health by repairing and fostering those relationships. And it's really characterized as being in this circle, in a circle of reciprocity. And we see, because of the industrialized food system globally, how we've moved away from that. how we don't even think about that. We don't really think about that when we walk into a store and we pick up a package of food. What is, you know, you consider food. Say you pick up a package of chicken that's wrapped in plastic, that's sitting on plastic. You don't think of having a relationship with it. And so we really need to move back to that, to know that those animals or those plants, both giving their lives to you, that you have to in turn give something back to them. So to rebuild those circles of reciprocity that really ground that relationship that we should be having with the environment around us.
Thank you so much. And I see a lot of people are sharing links to the book, to Braiding Sweetgrass in the chat. Awesome. Yeah. So yeah, oh man, it's already 7:15. I'll just, I know, I want to have time for audience questions too. So, but I do really want to get to this part because one of the lines that I really loved in your book was this quote: "Indigenous peoples recognize that eating our traditional foods and making the choice to eat these foods is in itself a political act." And we had talked before a little bit about the way that this relates to a story that probably a lot of people who are, you know, coming from MOHAI and our local, you know, non-native Washingtonians remember the story of the Macaw whale hunt that happened in the 90s and the political, dialogue that happened at that time, the political, I'm trying to think of the word that, but anyway, the politics of that and the way that it was reported on by non-native media members. I think a lot of people remember that. And I wanted to see if you would be able to talk a little bit more about that hunt and what it means in the broader sense of food sovereignty and the broader sense of food as a political act.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that question. And I left this slide up because, and we can come back to this slide. I know we're getting close in the end of the talk and opening to the Q&A, but I just wanted to share that Nuu-chah-nulth philosophy when I was talking about circles of reciprocity and our philosophy. The Macaw Nuu-chah-nulth whaling tradition. So while we're seeing a lot of Indigenous communities moving forward with these food sovereignty initiatives, start really trying to re-engage with harvesting again or strengthening their harvesting practices. Many communities are starting community gardens. We're seeing that here with the Muckleshoot Food Sovereignty project that Valerie Seacrest, just a wonderful, wonderful person who's doing great work around food sovereignty, that, you know, and the Muckleshoot and many other tribes in this area, the Nisqually as well, have a food community food garden. We're seeing these expanding and flourishing, but even within that, Indigenous peoples are continually facing challenges in enacting food sovereignty, in trying to maintain or strengthening connections to our traditional foods. And this was really exemplified in the Macaw whale hunt and the anti-whaling protests that arose in the 1990s when the Macaw and my people, the Nuu-chah-nulth, said we were going to re-engage with our whaling practices. And so I wrote this book that's on the slide, my book, Spirits of the Whaling, Our Whaling Ancestors, and it looks at the revitalization of that tradition, of our whaling tradition. And I also bring this conversation into my current book as well. So in 1999, the Macaw tribe on the western tip of Washington state harvested a Tseshaht, a ma'ak, which means gray whale. They harvested a gray whale. With that one throw of their harpoon, they enacted food sovereignty, and they enacted it by revitalizing and reinforcing a cultural tradition that is central to their identities. It's central to our identities. The Macaw and Nuu-chah-nulth people are relatives. We share the same traditions. We share the same cultures, and we share the same languages and this tradition of hunting whales. And so for the Macaw and for my people, the Nuu-chah-nulth, whaling really was the foundation of our political, social, spiritual, and economic structures. Many people didn't see that, didn't understand that, didn't care to understand that, even though we're trying to express that in the 1990s when the Macaw were getting ready to move forward with their hunt. The Macaw have a treaty protected right to hunt whales. In their 1855 Treaty of Bay, it states that they have the right to fish, to hunt, to seal, and as well as to harvest whales, to hunt whales. They're the only tribe in the United States that has a right to hunt whales protected in a treaty. But what we saw happen following colonization, especially here on the Northwest coast and here in the Puget Sound area in Western Washington, in the mid-1800s, we started seeing more and more people moving into this area. And as a result, we start seeing also competition for the foods in this area. We start seeing the rise of industry, the rise of the fishing industry, sealing industry, as well as commercial fishing, or excuse me, commercial whaling. Commercial whaling by the early 1900s almost decimated the whale populations that migrate up and down the Northwest coast, from the Baja Peninsula in California up to southeastern Alaska. Unregulated commercial whaling almost wiped out those whales. So the Macaw and my people had to put down our harpoons in the mid 1920s because our lives had been completely disrupted because of colonization. It also made it very difficult for our whaling chiefs to harvest whales. I think I have in my book, in the 1910 census of whale populations, they could only find 1 or 2 gray whales that were migrating up this coast. The gray whale and the humpback whale were the 2 major whales the Macaw and Nuu-chah-nulth hunted. And so in the 1970s, or excuse me, in the 1970s, the gray whale was finally placed on the endangered species list here in the United States, so it could start rebounding and to build into a healthy population. And by the 1990s, it did. There were over 16,000 whales in that population, a very healthy population from 1973 when there were about 1,700. It was a population that could be harvested again. So when the Macaw moved forward to harvest this whale, understanding they did have a treaty protected right, they went to the large global whaling commission, the International Whaling Commission, to get a quota to harvest whales. And they received the quota and they went out and they hunted their whale in 1999. But there was such a backlash. There was such a backlash to the harvesting of that one whale that, you know, we really had, in thinking about it, we have to really think about, well, why? What happened? Where did this come from? Why were there so many people, even though the International Whaling Commission, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, as well as the National Fisheries Service here in the United States, were saying that the whale population was so abundant, it could be harvested. There were also marine biologists saying there were so many whales by the late 1990s, moving into 2000, that they reached their carrying capacity in their feeding grounds. And I don't know how many of you remember, I can't remember what year that was, 2007 or 8, when there were gray whales beaching themselves, literally beaching themselves along the Northwest coast. And when they were doing studies on them, they found that their fat was very, very thin. So yes, it could be the change, and probably was change in ocean temperatures because of global climate change, contamination in the waters that were impacting them, but also that they were also beyond their feeding capacity. They weren't able to get the food they needed. So why, if you wanted to protect whales, would you not want the Macaw to traditionally, through spirituality, through prayer, through this tradition that we had and still maintain in our communities, to not want us to harvest whales? It didn't make sense to many people. Didn't make sense to me, which is why I wrote the book and wanted to know more of that history. And I say, you know, many of the people had misconceptions about who we are as Indigenous peoples anyway. The stereotypes of Indigenous peoples came to the forefront. When the Macaw were getting ready to harvest, there were people outside the Macaw community with signs saying, they're nothing but a bunch of savages. You know, thinking back to those classic Westerns when the Indigenous person, the Native American within those classic US Westerns were painted as savage barbarians. And those images start coming forward as the Macaw were getting ready to hunt and after their hunt. And also there was this notion of that hunt not being traditional because the Macaw were incorporating safety measures, bringing in safety boats around them when they were hunting in their traditional canoe, that they had somebody there with a high-powered gun that after they harpooned the whale, they could shoot that whale so that it would die very quickly, giving it a humane death. But there were people who said it wasn't culturally authentic. And I include in the quote from my whaling book, and I included it in this book as well. And it's a quote from Macaw tribal member Janine Beauchamp, who is the director of the Macaw Cultural and Research Center, a beautiful research center out in Nia Bay. She responded to this notion of cultural authenticity. And she says, and I quote Janine, "For some reason, some people like to freeze us in the past. If you're not doing something the way it was done prior to contact, then you're not doing it right. You're not doing it in the native way. But we allow other cultures to make changes. One of my friends said, I'm a white American, but I don't make my butter in a butter churn anymore. And I'm not criticized for that. Folks don't ride around in covered wagons anymore, but we don't turn around and say, gee, you're not a real American. But unfortunately, we Indigenous peoples are continually criticized if we do anything different than we did 500 years ago," end quote. And so I really love that quote because she puts that into perspective that, you know, our cultures do change. Our cultures do shift along with other cultures. And, you know, there's also this notion of what I call culinary imperialism that I see in this, and I see it whenever we attempt to try to have conversations about the need to get our land back so that we can continue to thrive in these communities that we thrived in for centuries, that we thrived in since time immemorial. One of the main arguments against the Macaw tribe was centered in a foods-based discourse, with members of this anti-whaling coalition arguing that both the Macaw and Nuu-chah-nulth people didn't need to hunt whales for food. We had enough food. Go to the grocery store. You don't need these foods. And Indigenous peoples globally have struggled to have access to our foods, to have access to the production of these food sources, to be able to harvest our foods, to fish, to hunt. Through the history of Western hegemonic control over food production and consumption, this really kept us from our traditional food sources. So it was the way that we were trying to re-engage with those food sources, but through those assertions of both cultural and culinary imperialism, that many people continue to impose their symbolic and aesthetic food values on us. I hear this as well when I talk about hunting, when people say, well, I'm vegan, and I think your community should be vegan. Well, tell the people up in Northern Alaska and Northern Canada to be vegan when you can barely put a shovel in the ground because you have frozen tundra. You know, that people, that the foods they eat are still nutrition, still have many nutrients in them. Yet, even though we do see a lot of our foods also being impacted by contamination, those those traditional foods still do have the nutrients that we need. They still are nutritious foods. So I want to say that, in just closing from that question, in my culture, we have an understanding that everything, animals, plants, humans, that we all exist in a shared environment where we are all equal. We're all considered equal. We live in this world of reciprocity. In all our relationships with the animals and the plants that give themselves to us, we pray, we have sacred ceremony. Here in the Northwest Coast, we have first species ceremonies, as well as the first salmon ceremony, which we've seen being revitalized here within the regional tribes in this area. And it really is, affirming those relationships that we have to everything that gives themselves to us as food. Unfortunately, because of that anti-whaling coalition, the Macaw had faced a court case in 2002, a district court case that has stopped the tribe from exercising their treaty right to whale. The court, they still are in the process of trying to be able to whale again. They need to conduct another environmental statement or environmental impact statement through the National Environmental Protection Act. And they're also seeking a waiver for the Marine Mammal Protection Act, which that district court ruling said they needed, even though they have the treaty right to whale. So that's the situation today, unfortunately, that the Macaw are being kept from this traditional food source as a result of that coalition that started that anti-whaling discourse in the 1990s.
Yeah, I hope everyone, who grew up in this region, I was in grade school when that happened, and I remember the vitriol and the anti-Indigenous reporting that happened. Growing up is about learning the things that you learned as a kid were not always correct and getting context in the world around you. So I'm hoping that people, who maybe didn't know about this event with this cultural context will be able to learn more and do their own research and hopefully read Charlotte's prior book as well. We're coming up and I want to have time for questions from the audience because we have a few, but just sort of to wrap up, did you want to share another story to sort of send us out? I think you had another story about fishing.
I did. So I'm just, as you were talking, I was moving through some of the whaling slides. And then there's Janine Beauchamp's statement that I read. And I wanted to also say the whale that they harvested, which shows how we revere the foods, the animals that give themselves to us. They have the skeleton, which the children, the youth from Nia Bay, from Macaw, ended up putting the skeleton together, and it's now in that Cultural Research Center, so you can see it if you go out there. And I don't know if Nia Bay has opened. I know they were closed because of the pandemic, but you can call the Cultural and Research Center and they will let you know if they open or if they're open. So I wanted to share this. I wanted to talk about salmon. You ask anyone in the Northwest Coast what foods they ate or what foods they love or what foods they wish they had at that moment, salmon. I grew up the same way. I grew up around salmon. I share salmon stories along with my berry picking stories. These are some photos from my community. This photo is of community members on the left in their smokehouse getting salmon ready to be smoked in the smokehouse. And the photo in the middle is the photo of Tsuma'as, the river that I say breathes life into us. It's the life vein that snakes through our community, that brings the beautiful sockeye salmon, what we call mi'at, and other species of salmon to us. And so we are really connected to the waters. And as a result, we have this every summer when the salmon are running, we come together and gather at the Tsuma'as in this beautiful area where there used to be a mill. It's called the dam. We still call it the dam because it was a paper mill dam. but we have our own names for it as well. But it's this Tsumas, the river that runs through us. And so I wanted to talk about that and end with that, and also share where I got the title for my book. One of our community members, Daryl Ross Sr., who is our cultural resources manager in our Tseshaht administrative office. I was interviewing some of our community members one afternoon, and he says, a happy Tseshaht has a drum in one hand and a saka in the other. And when I was working with the press editors, I said, hey, why don't we think about using that? And I thought, that's quite catchy. Let's use it. So that's where the name came from. Thank Daryl Ross Sr. So smoking fish, something I still do, I love to do. I grew up jarring fish and canning fish. And my Auntie Marilyn, and I share some of these photos in my book. Auntie Marilyn, it has a smokehouse from my Uncle Rudy, and we smoke fish. And this is one of our weekends smoking all that beautiful fish, and I'm getting hungry looking at it, and I might open up a jar of fish after we're finished here. But I wanted to end with a story about fishing with my sister Gail. So we had fished for years, she and I. And you can, even though we have community fish day or a communal fish day, you can also fish with individual gill nets. And so we used to fish many, many years ago. And then when I went away to go to school, I didn't really have time to fish with Gail. And so the last couple of years before COVID, we decided we needed to re-engage. We needed to bring back that tradition. And so I started, I told Gail, okay, let's do this. Let's bring it back. And so this was from one of our adventures. We went out and thought we're going to get out there. We don't need to ask anybody. We went out and set our net, which you set out in the middle of the river, but we never thought about the tidal shifts. We ended up setting on a pole and setting our net at high tide. And when we came back 4 hours later, it was low tide, and we had caught a lot of fish. They were just way up, burning in the sun in a net that was completely exposed. And I say, yeah, tidal shift lesson quickly learned. But I want to end with this story about us going fishing a couple of years ago. And it was we started getting ready and had put everything in the boat, and we're heading out to put the boat in the water. And me and Gail and our fishing partner, and you can see him on the top on the right, that's Gail's husband, Reg. Well, it's her first husband. Her current husband, Richie, doesn't fish, but Richie doesn't mind. They're very good friends. And so Gail and Reg have continued to fish for years. And so I went out with them and said, let's do it. Let's go back and let's bring this back. And so I'm going to read now so that I don't keep embellishing here. I was excited to gill net fish once again, and much to my sister's surprise, I still had my old royal blue fishing attire from the 1980s. Gill net fishing opens as the miat, or the Sakai salmon, make their way up the Sumaas, or the Tsomas River. And when the fish runs begin to enter our territory, the day and time are scheduled, usually a 12-hour opening beginning at 6 or 8 in the evening and closing at about 5 or 6 in the morning. Most fishers, once they set their net, stay with the net all evening, checking it periodically to remove any fish that has been caught. Gail and I got our food supplies ready. Lots of coffee for her and Reg, lots of water for me, salmon sandwiches, a few bags of cheesies. And if you're not from Canada, you won't know what cheesies are. They're junk food. And a bag of raw almonds. As the fishing opening neared, we packed our net and supplies in the boat, hooked the boat up to Gail's husband Richie's boat, and headed to the marina to launch our boat. Then, along with all the other fishers in the water, we started looking for a good place to set the net and camp for the evening. At first, it was fun, like the old days, and Gail and I rehashed stories about our fishing adventures from the 80s, laughing as we drank our coffee and water and ate some of our snacks. A few hours went by and we began our first check of the net. We put on our headlamps, these little lamps that you put on your head with a strap, which helps you see in the dark, helps you see the net. We bent over the edge of the boat and began pulling up the net to check if we had any fish. As we made our way along the net, we took off the fish and placed them in a container in the boat. We made our way to the end of the net and then sat down in the boat for another few hours before doing the same thing over again. We pulled out our smokes, yes, nasty fishing habit, grabbed some more coffee, and then checked Facebook to see how the other fishers were doing. I'd forgotten how extended and tedious gillnet fishing is, and our laughter began turning into complaints as my sister and I got wet, cold, and tired. 5 hours into a 12-hour fishing opening, our conversations about the fun we had fishing took a turn. I say to my sister, "I'm hungry. Is this all we have for food? Maybe we should phone Richie to bring us some more fish sandwiches or hamburgers." My sister replied, "Well, quit eating all the food. I told you it had to last us all night." A few minutes later, I was at it again. "Is this it for water? I thought we brought another jug." My sister replied, "No, we didn't. I can't believe you already drank all the water. Jesus." A half hour later, I say to my sister, "Sis, I need to pee." My sister replied, "For Christ's sake, then stick your bum over the edge and pee." I looked at her and she looked at me and we burst out laughing. I took my pee and we snuggled back down into the front of the boat together and stared out into the calm darkness of the night as the soft waves rocked our boat back and forth. It would be a few more hours before we'd have to check our net again. At the back of the boat, Reg sat, cigarette in hand, staring out at the water, listening to his crazy fishing partners. Two sisters reinforcing their love for each other as they strengthened their cultural bonds to the Miot, the Sakai salmon, and to the Tsuma-as, the river that runs through us.
Thank you so much. That was a beautiful way to close this portion of the presentation. And thank you for all your slides and for all your stories. And we have a few questions from the audience, actually. We probably won't be able to get to all of them, but we have, I'll try to condense them because there are a few that sort of have similar themes. But from Jennifer, we have, "I am Macaw and chef by profession. I have a calling to share my gift back with my tribe. My vision is to make our pre-colonial diet accessible to modern grocery resources. It has been very difficult to find what we ate then, how we ate it, what we ate it with, because those combinations are healing. Do you have any resources to pre-colonial, pre-commodities ingredients or recipes?"
Well, that's really interesting. Well, there's a really good, if you're on Facebook, who is the person again?
This is Jennifer.
Jennifer, there's a really good Facebook group page called Food Sovereignty is Indigenous Sovereignty. And they post a lot of recipes on that site. So if you are on Facebook, I don't know if they have a website, if there's a website, but it's a great resource. And also my, one of the people that I talk about, and oh shoot, I didn't get to her as well, Nitanis and John Desjardins, I wrote a book about them and their family because for a year, they lived off the grid. They went and lived in a place where there was no electricity, there was no grocery stores, there was nothing. They just was some old cabins that they refurbished. They did that as a way of indigenizing their diet. Well, Nitanis has been one of these avid harvesters, and what she's trying to do is exactly what you're talking about. Rather than having some of our traditional food, but incorporating it with non-traditional, like for example, fish and rice. I grew up with fish and rice. I never thought about it. All I thought was I'm eating my traditional food, but not thinking I'm eating it with rice. That isn't traditional. What she's trying to do is incorporate or make menus so that everything within that menu comes from those places where they harvest it. So that you're, for example, bringing in seafood and eating seafood as an accompaniment to salmon, or accompanying the shellfish that they harvest. So those kinds of things. But I would say check out that Facebook page if you are on Facebook, because they have some really great recipes that focus on just traditional foods. Good question.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great resource. We have an anonymous question that says, what can individuals do to support Indigenous food sovereignty? Are there native plants that can be cultivated on a small scale and shared, or is this a systematic issue and incident or individual action needs to be on an advocacy or policy level?
Whoa, that's a loaded question there. Well, first, to just answer part of it, I really hope that sharing my stories and my food stories from the Northwest Coast prompts people to want to change their lifestyles and to make food choices, healthy food choices that strengthen your own individual health, but also strengthen the health and wellness of your communities. So I really hope that you can do that. The second part of the question was, oh no, I forgot.
Are there individual choices that people can make, individual native plants people can cultivate, or is the problem of sort of the separation of us from our food systems so systematic and large that we really need to be focused more on the sort of policy shift rather than individual?
Well, I think there's a place for all of us to re-engage with the lands around us, as long as if we're not, for people who are not from Indigenous communities, that you're respectful to those communities on whose homelands you're harvesting. I know people go out here to Discovery Park. I am part of an organization called MOHAI Fund. It is a Native female-led nonprofit organization. And a major area or major part of our work is food sovereignty work. And we work with tribes in this area. We also work with urban Indigenous peoples, but we're always respectful that many of us are doing this work not on our lands, not within our own homeland. So if you are going to harvest, take that into consideration. And also think about how we can come together to support Indigenous land back movements. Support or to create awareness around global climate change and the impact it's having on, especially on Indigenous peoples. It's having on all of us, but especially on Indigenous peoples who have place-based food systems, that our foods, our lives, our identities are connected and tied to those homelands. So to creating awareness is good, being a good ally in supporting initiatives like salmon habitat restoration, for example, that many of the Northwest Coast Indigenous tribal and First Nations communities are working towards, lessening the impact on our environment, especially by fish farms. Many of the tribes or the First Nations along the West Coast of British Columbia are pushing the federal government to close those fish farms because of the contamination from those open pen fish farms are having on our wild salmon and on our other marine-based foods. So just, thinking about what it means to be a good ally and how to be a good ally, I think is a really good first step.
Yeah, and sort of related to that, we have a question from another anonymous attendee. And they say, I'm Anishinaabe living in Washington, and I'm struggling with if it's ethical for me to gather in my traditional ways here on land that I don't belong to.
And I think that really fits with what I have just stated, that, if like I said, we do it, we're, out in Discovery Park by Daybreak Star. A lot of urban people live here, urban Indigenous people who aren't from the regional communities, but be respectful of those communities. If you're going into territories where whose territory it is, whose traditional territory it is, maybe reach out and consult with those communities to let them know what you want to do, and so that hopefully get their blessing that you can harvest. Most communities do. We in our communities back home are, as long as people are being respectful and they're not hurting the land, they're not over harvesting or overfishing, that we work alongside these, you know, these communities as well, communities outside of our own Indigenous communities. So I'd say just being respectful that it's not your territory.
Yeah. We have one from Odette. It says, I'm curious about gentrification of Indigenous foods. We also see this with cultural staples for New Canadians foods. They're available, but at high prices for foodies, not families. Do you think there's a way to avoid this happening? So this sort of, I feel like this is getting to the commodification of food in general. How do we avoid falling into that system, I guess?
Yeah, I'm kind of confused by that. Meaning the commodification of our traditional foods, of our cultural foods?
Yeah, I think that's what they mean.
Well, I mean, our foods are part of that. I mean, salmon, you know, look at, you know, everybody eats salmon here on the Northwest coast. So there's no getting away from it. You know, I mean, that unfortunately, a lot of the foods that we relied on and still rely on have been part of the commodification, have been part of that food system, you know, because of the industrialization and because of the growth of industry. So, I mean, I think it's already happened, Odette. We already have seen it. What we really need to do is understand how it impacts us. If our salmon is being threatened for everyone, what does that mean for Indigenous peoples and Indigenous communities that rely on that salmon? And for many communities, for their very, very survival, many communities eat salmon as a main staple. It's still a main staple in their diets. What happens if we see overfishing of that salmon or contaminants degrading habitat of salmon, so that we don't have those salmon stocks, we don't have those salmon runs every year? And we're seeing it. We're constantly seeing it, especially with climate change and the warming of the waters here, where, you know, if the water, I think it's over 70 degrees or 72 degrees. If the ocean waters go higher than that, salmon can't live in that water. We might see, you know, if we don't see a shift in global warming, we might see that happen here. And it's a serious threat. And many of the tribal communities up and down the Northwest coast are looking at climate change and its impact on their communities and how they can work with other people, other communities, other tribal communities, other non-Indigenous communities to come together in allyship, to come together and build relationships. And there's one organization, I can't remember what they're called now, the Salish Sea Cooperative or something like that, but people coming together because, you know, all of us are relying on the same food sources in many ways. So it's to all our benefits to make sure that those salmon populations are healthy and those salmon habitats are healthy, as well as the other foods in this area, and marine-based foods, as well as the land-based foods that all of us rely on.
Absolutely. And, you know, finally, I think there's a lot of questions. People really want to know about more resources about Indigenous food sovereignty, resources for getting involved in any kind of food sovereignty movements, resources for buying heirloom seeds, and a lot of people asking where they can get seeds.
If you're interested, and let me see if I can get into the chat. Let's see, and I can post to everyone. Check out our organization. I serve as a board member on this organization. Naha Ilahi Fund. And I wish I could, I can't figure out how to put there. Well, I guess I can stop sharing.
I can, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, Naha Ilihi Fund. So the Naha Ilihi Fund does work around that. I don't have anything about heirloom seeds in my book because my book is focused on marine-based cultures and the Northwest coast. Mm-hmm. There are, I know a resource. Let me put it in here. Elizabeth Hoover and her book.
And I put a link to the Nuu-chah-nulth Fund.
Okay. I wonder, Kiko, you might be faster than me in finding Elizabeth Hoover's book, Indigenous Food Sovereignty. It's a great book. Valerie Seacrest, many people from this area are participated in that. It's an edited volume. So the voices of many Northwest Coast people and people from Washington State are in that book. So if you wanted to find more research, I would say go and pick up her book. It's absolutely amazing. Liz is a really good friend of mine. And I'm really glad that she did include some of the voices from here, because most of that book focuses on seed sovereignty. It focuses on agricultural-based Indigenous societies, which is why I wanted my book to focus on the Northwest Coast, why I stuck with just focusing on Northwest Coast Indigenous food sovereignty. But that's a really, really good resource. And like I said, it's an edited volume. So if you wanted to check it out, it's just really, a really, really great book. Elizabeth Hoover and Devin Mahisua are the editors of that book. Yeah. Oh, somebody has it in there. Yeah. Indigenous food sovereignty in the United States. Awesome.
Yeah, people are sharing all kinds of great resources. Yeah. And hopefully the chat will be saved when we post the video. I'm not sure if that's true, but hopefully the chat will be saved and people can go back and look through these resources that have been posted and shared.
Yeah. I wish and it makes me think for the next time if we do any more Zooms and we're not in, rather in person. But what I could share on my screen, on my slides, I should have ended and had some of those resources, because I know a lot of people doing this kind of work. There was very few of us doing this work a few years ago, but many of us are getting involved now. Elizabeth Campbell, people from the Northwest Indian College, where Elizabeth Campbell and Valerie Seacrest started with their food program up there. And then Valerie went back to her community, her Muckleshoot community, and started the Muckleshoot Food Sovereignty Program. Elizabeth Campbell does a lot of work in that area as well. Elizabeth Hoover, someone who does work on, if you're looking outside of the US and Canada, Maria Elena Humbachano. I don't know if I can get her name in here. She's doing great work with the Maori. She's also a good friend of mine. The Maori in New Zealand and Indigenous peoples in New Zealand, and her work focuses on the Maori as well as Peru, her people in the Quechua people in Peru. So if you want to look at other food sovereignty, Indigenous food sovereignty outside of the US and Canada, I'd say pick up her articles. They're all online too, and you can find them in open journals. So you don't, she's coming out with a book, but she has a lot of articles that you can find online that are accessible through open access journals. So I'd say check her out. Yeah.
Well, we're just about running out of time, and everyone is sharing. And I've been told that MOHAI will send these links in their thank you email to people who registered for the event. So people will be getting the links, no worries. But thank you again so much, Charlotte, for coming and for talking and for reading from your book and for discussing Indigenous food sovereignty with us and sharing your stories.
Oh, well, Tlecko, thank you. Thank you for providing this space. You know, we're our Zoom world. Thank you for providing this space. I really appreciate it. Again, thank you to MOHAI. Thank you to University of Washington Press for coordinating this. Thank you to the ASL interpreters for being here as well. And thank you to everyone who came. I know some people have left as we're moving through this, through the talk today, but thank you for everyone who was here today. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to me share some of my stories and to share some of the research about Indigenous food sovereignty here in the Northwest Coast. Tlecko, I raise my hands to everyone.
Thank you. I'm sorry, where can people buy your book?
The book is available on Amazon, and it's Amazon US. For those in Canada, it's amazon.ca. So you can find the book on Amazon. If you don't like buying things on Amazon, I've had people tell me they don't. You can also find it at the University of Washington Press website. So University of Washington Press website. And maybe I can put that in there as well.
Yeah, and there's a link in the chat. So thank you everybody for coming, and thank you again to Charlotte and to our ASL interpreters, and thank you to MOHAI.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Coté, so much. And you also can get the book through the MOHAI Mercantile as well. We're carrying a copy of it online. And we're just so happy to have had you. This was a wonderful presentation. I know it's given me a lot to think about. Thank you, Kiku, for your fantastic moderation, and to HistoryLink in general for being such a great partner. Thank you again to our ASL interpreters and to our captioner tonight for making this a more accessible space. So if you liked what you saw tonight and want to learn even more history, we invite you to come back next month. We're going to be talking about historic preservation and expanding what buildings get preserved. Because often it's only been things that are beautiful architecturally, but not looking at the cultural significance. So it's going to be a great panel discussion, and that'll be up on our website too. So it's April 20th. And we also have a survey that we're going to put in the chat. We'll send this out over email too. We would love if you could take just a few minutes to answer some questions so we know what kinds of programming you're interested in the future, and what you thought of tonight. And if you do answer, you will be entered in a raffle for tickets to future programs. And then finally, if you learned something new or enjoy the work that we do, we ask that you make a donation to MOHAI. Consider making a gift or becoming a member to help us sustain ourselves through the impact of the pandemic closure and the continuing pandemic. So thank you so much, everyone. And look forward to continuing to being in learning communities with you. And I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your night, and that we'll see you at another program soon. Thank you.